Okay, I have touched on this before in the context of identity politics and other issues that I think are problematic. But I think the issue is still very pertinent to the present time. Um, and I want to talk about how certain charges that are held against people are seemingly just thrown around with impunity, and there's very little onus, in my opinion, on those making the charges. When I'm talking about charges, I mean really smears. Racism, sexism, homophobia, those three in particular. There are others: transphobia, anti Semitism, Islamophobia, any sort of charge that portrays the person as some sort of bigot. Now, I want to be very clear here. I am not for a second saying that these problems don't exist. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. Any one of those you could find clear examples of them, right? So I'm not one of these people that say, oh, there's no problem, it's all overblown, or there's nothing there, right? There is. Every one of those things you can find clear examples. Just off the top of my head, if we look at racism, and by the way, I'm talking here about the context of Western society, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom. And I think there's a bit of crossover in terms of how identity politics can be seen in both our societies. But anyway, to look at the racism issue, I mean, what happened to Eric Garner, it is hard to believe that that would happen to a white suspect in the same way, right? So I do think there are areas where there are legitimate concerns, racial, racially based concerns. I don't think that is made up. I don't think it's overblown or imaginary. I do think there are legitimate grievances about issues like that. If we look at homophobia, there is that awful track on the no, I was going to say London Underground, on the bus in London recently, where the lesbian couple were viciously attacked, and there was a young gay man in Lancashire brutally beaten by a gang. Um, Sexism, I think that there's just as much anti-male sexism as female sexism. I mean, what Caroline Lucas called for recently to me is blatantly sexist. Let's have a women-only cabinet. That's just a blatantly sexist proposition, but of course she got away with it because she's a woman. Um, but here's my contention, right? That particularly in left-wing establishments, a good example of this is Hollywood. You know, it's basically elite left. That's what Hollywood is. Um, and I'm not saying that as some sort of Trumpian conspiracy theorist. I consider myself politically centrist, and there's areas I would agree with the Hollywood sort of narrative on things, the liberal outlook on certain things. So, on an issue, for example, like gun violence in America, I just read a report today that there's a gun store in Texas that is actually having a back to school discount on firearms. Now, that's insanity, right? So, there are areas where I'm politically more to the left. On welfare, for example, I think it's wrong that unemployed people in Britain are treated like dirt, and yet big companies can avoid tax and not be treated with the same contempt. So there are a lot of areas I would identify with the political left or more to the left. I would never call myself a leftist because I'm not, but there's areas I would be more aligned to the left on. But when it comes to identity politics, when it comes to this constant victimhood narrative, like it must be because someone's a minority, it must be because they're a woman, it must be. And actually, when it comes to the gender thing, I'm not even sure if that can fit into identity politics, although it's moved that way, because there's actually slightly more women than there are men. So that's not even a minority issue, but it's all about if you're not if you're anyone except a white straight male, then you're the enemy to people who push identity politics. Because if you're a white straight male, I don't actually believe that white straight males, by the way, are victims. I'm not saying that, but I am saying they are the number one target of people who push identity politics. And I pretty much fit into that category. I'm a 33-year-old straight white male. I'm not a victim, and I accept that there are areas that I mean, I don't have the experience of a black man in America, right? But I know that my life hasn't been one big easy ride. I've had periods of real struggle. And all I'm saying is, when we see charges like racism and sexism and homophobia and other such isms thrown around at people, there tends to be a situation whereby the person being accused of it, and this is particularly true in Hollywood, they will be completely blacklisted. It's kind of the modern equivalent, I would say, of what happened in the 1950s with McCarthyism, where the charge of communism was thrown around. Oh, you don't agree with the government, you're a communist. Well, today, it's not so much about the government because obviously Trump's in office, but it's more if you don't agree with the liberal establishment, by which I mean Hollywood and certain powerful media outlets, CNN, um, New York Times, etc. I mean, CNN recently took issue with Trump only criticizing the far left, but they negated to mention that they only criticize the far right. They failed to criticize the far left. So it's kind of like the pot calling the kettle black. I do think Trump's a disgrace. I've no time for the man. I think he has done things that really no president should be saying and doing. But what Trump has been effective in is exposing, by default, liberal hypocrisy on issues like race. Because, um, CNN, if you had a hate crime committed by a black gang against, say, a white person, CNN would totally ignore it. So it's a bit rich of them to accuse Trump of only focusing on the far left in his critique when they only focus on the far right. My contention as a centrist is both are a problem. And I'm not saying, because I've heard this thing with Antifa, there's no moral comparison between racists and their opponents. That's a completely absurd argument. That's like saying anyone can literally hide behind calling themselves an anti fascist and therefore they're morally right. Well, Joseph Stalin hated fascism, yet he killed millions of people. So, as far as I'm concerned, Antifa, by the way, are a bunch of thugs. And the fact that they're not racist, the fact that they're inclusive in their thuggery, doesn't mean they're okay. And I really do feel concerned that this polarization, these culture wars, are only going to get deeper if people don't look at themselves and think, am I consistent? I mean, I'm not coming here from a holier than thou position. I very often question myself. I very often say, well, am I consistent on this? And I think you have to. If you have values, you have to be consistent and you have to question yourself. But I think that when a charge of racism or sexism or homophobia or whatever the ism is, sometimes that may well be a legitimate charge. There are racists, there are sexists, and there are homophobes. But I also think there should be an onus on those making the charge to provide solid evidence for it. So if a public figure is accused of racism, and this goes right up to the president, although I do frankly think Trump has come out with racist sentiments, and I think there's evidence for that. But this isn't just about Trump. I'm not going to, because there's time limits on the video. The point I would make is where there are charges against people, there needs to be solid evidence. So if a public figure is accused of racism, they might be racist. And it's right that they are challenged for that. But I also think the person or people making the charge need to clearly explain why. And you get an outlet like CNN, which is very powerful. They will have someone on who's making a charge of racism, and they'll simply go along with it. They'll say, "Oh yes, you're calling this person racist. What do you think we could do to stand up against racism?" That's the question. It's not like, "So what's your basis for this claim?" To me, that would be fair journalism. But CNN's got a very obvious, blatant liberal bias. Now, Fox News has a conservative bias. It works on both sides, and they're both as bad as each other. In the Obama years, and this is something that conservatives need to remember, Fox News hardly treated Obama fairly. They hardly gave him a fair hearing. Um, and they had a token liberal, just like CNN will have the occasional token conservative. The problem, as I see it in the American system, is there's no media accountability. There's no independent watchdog, really. They can hold these big outlets to account. They can say they've been guilty of bias. That's why if Trump does get re-elected, it will be a perception that it's the establishment out to get him. Hollywood, CNN, New York Times, etc. So the Democrats, I think, have to tread carefully not to appear that they're part of the liberal establishment. Therefore, I think it would be a mistake if the 2020 candidate panders too much to Hollywood celebrities. Like, Hollywood celebrities are citizens. They still have a right to have their views, but I really think the 2020 contenders need to understand why Trump won in the first place. But anyway, not to derail into party politics, I think it absolutely, I'll be honest, it really angers me how easily it is, and we get it in this country as well, for people to just be smeared as a racist. Because, for example, they may have concerns about immigration. And there is, when certain people on the left, I'm not going to say everyone on the left, but I've seen it. I have people in my contact list who just come out with, oh, got a problem with immigrants. Maybe the problem is because of your racism. Or maybe it's not that they have a problem with immigrants in general. Maybe they have a problem with people abusing the system, you know? So I despise when complex subjects are oversimplified by people who just have an agenda of smearing their opponents. And it's not that those problems don't exist. There are times when someone being accused of racism is a racist. Okay. And I also, for what it's worth, I've seen people who really are blood and soil nationalists who have blatant racist sentiments get worked up when they're called out, when they are exposed. So I'm not talking in defense of those people. You know, I've I've been accused of being a namby-pamby lefty liberal for calling out blood and soil nationalist types. So I know the sort of mentality they have, but I still think that if you're going to make a charge of racism, and I would say racism is by far the most, being accused of being a homophobe or a sexist is bad. It still has an implication. It still can hurt someone's reputation and career. But there's nothing, in my view, more toxic than the charge of racism. There's something particularly, especially in America, that is so damaging to someone's reputation. And it just seems to me that people are potentially being, their reputations or career is being destroyed over these charges. And it does also apply to allegations of, I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but if we look at Me Too, look at the number of prominent men who've been accused of misconduct. And yet, how many actual trials have we seen? How much due process have we actually seen? I find that deeply concerning, just how casually, like, it seems there's almost no man in Hollywood who hasn't been accused at this point. And it makes you wonder, okay, is there a widespread problem in the industry? Or frankly, are some people trying to get even because maybe they didn't get a role or they had some dispute with the man in question? I just think that if charges are made against someone, it is one of the principles of a democratic and free society that that person has a fair trial, has a fair hearing. And it seems to me these basic democratic principles are at risk of being eroded by people who they're allowed to just throw out accusations. And once again, I'm not saying there's no smoke without fire. I'm not saying it's all false. Not at all. That is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that instead of the onus being entirely on the accused, in any situation, would it be accusations of sexual misconduct, accusations that someone is a racist or whatever, instead of the onus always being on them to have to defend themselves, there should also be onus on the accuser, on the people saying that, to back up why the person is a racist. I'm sick and tired of hearing, oh, you're a racist because you have concerns about immigration, or you're a racist because you, there's many examples of where this can go. But I don't want to go too far off on a tangent. I'm going to wrap up there. I really, really see this as a problem. And someone like myself who identifies with the center, like I say, there's areas where I would call myself center left. The far right, white supremacists have attacked me because they've accused me of being a namby-pamby liberal. And I don't, I take that as a badge of honor coming from them. But my point is, the intolerance of the left in areas like this, of just throwing out accusations at people, is going to push people who might actually be left wing further to the right. Because they'll think, well, if someone like me, who's always been against racism, is going to be smeared as a racist over nothing, and that's why I despise Antifa, because they're a bunch of intolerant, self righteous thugs. They hide behind anti fascism to legitimize themselves. And yeah, okay, they're often going up against white supremacists and so on who are actual racists. But Antifa will accuse anyone who doesn't see the world exactly as they do as being a racist. So if you say to an Antifa person you have concerns about immigration being abused, they'll say, oh, you're a white supremacist. I really despise that sort of intolerant way of thinking. And I really think that it's about time that there is some balancing in terms of people making accusations being put on the spot and having to explain why. It doesn't mean that they're wrong. There are situations, like I say, where those accusations are appropriate. But on both sides of the Atlantic, there is too much pandering to double standards as well. I'll just close with this point. I came across a book on Waterstones recently entitled Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race. Why is it? Why is it we tolerate these double standards? Why is it